Somewhere in the ancient rhythm of a Gregorian chant, a note falls slightly out of line, barely noticeable, like the hesitation between two breaths. It does not clash. It does not disrupt. It only bends. A subtle discord in the perfect cadence of centuries. And yet in that barely audible shift, something old and unrecorded begins to stir. Rome in the 9th century stood still but uneasy. Empires, fractured lands scattered beneath feudal fingers, and within the heart of Christendom, papal succession was meant to remain an unbroken chain, a divine order. But there is a moment, a silence wrapped in ritual, where the chain hums uncertainly. Between Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III, something slips. Some lists say one thing, others say another. A name appears, then vanishes. John. Or was it Joan? The chronicles diverge not by contradiction, but by omission. Among the earliest murmurs is the Chronica Universalis Metensis, which first hints no insinuates a pontiff who was not as he seemed. And centuries later in the 12th century, the De Septem Donis Spiritus Sancti dares speak the tale aloud of a woman dressed in priestly robes, rising through the Church's hierarchy, until she sat upon the throne of St. Peter itself. The story, they say, was already old by then. But who tells the tale first is not as curious as who refuses to tell it at all. In the Liber Pontificalis, the official record of popes, the years between 855 and 858 are ambiguous. Leo IV dies. Benedict III takes his place. Smooth succession according to the Church. No mention of an interlude, no breach, no disruption. Yet in some versions, even Benedict's elevation is contested and antipope Anastasius briefly holds the office. Or so it is claimed. But what if Anastasius was not the one who needed hiding? There is a particular statue, long destroyed, once said to stand near the Via Sacra in Rome, a female figure crowned holding a papal staff and bearing a child. Locals called her Papessa. Pilgrims paused not to pray but to wonder, and just as quietly one day the statue vanished, carried away by time or decree. They say she gave birth during a procession, not in private shame, but in public spectacle. The road from the Basilica of St. Peter to the Lateran was sacred ground. No earthly cries should interrupt its solemnity. And yet a wail, new and wet with life, split the incense-laden air. It was then the truth, long hidden beneath cassock and title unraveled. She was not he. And the Church recoiled. From that moment forward, the tale takes on the shape of smoke. It drifts, it seeps into stone and shadow, but never stays. No two accounts align perfectly, yet none deny her completely. Some say she was English, others German. Some place her in the 9th century, others shift her forward or back. But always she is cloaked in doubt, as if doubt itself is the last vestment she was allowed to wear. In medieval Europe, doubt could be heresy, but silent silence was doctrine. What kind of institution would quietly adjust its records, realign its rituals, and rewrite its own past to ensure an anomaly disappears without noise? Perhaps not one that lies, but one that edits. The same way a monk might scrape vellum clean before rewriting a sacred text. The old ink still lingers ghost-like beneath the new. Today, the Vatican denies she ever existed. Officially, there was no Pope Joan, no papal pregnancy, no scandal, and yet until the 17th century, her tale was not only widespread, but treated as historical. Even Protestant critics of Rome used her story as proof of the Church's fallibility, too useful a fable to abandon, too dangerous a truth to confirm. And so she remains half myth, half memory, like a faint echo in a vaulted cathedral heard only when everything else goes quiet. Between the columns of history there are always gaps, not fractures, not holes, but softened absences, like rain-worn names on an ancient tomb smoothed by time and reluctance. One such silence lies precisely between Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III. Not a void, exactly, more a hesitation, as though time briefly held its breath. What happens in 3 years that leaves no trace? No signature on edicts, no additions to sacred canon, no mention in the thick manuscripts kept in scriptoria. And yet oral tradition carries something forward, a woman cloaked in the dignity of the Church, ruling unnoticed or unacknowledged. Joan, Ioanna, John Anglicus, some say, a name chosen not for deception but survival. The legend becomes a mirror, and as with all mirrors, it reflects both the viewer and the veiled. A woman scholar's whisper who studied in Athens or Mainz, disguised as a man, yes, but not hidden. She rose by intellect, by eloquence, by unwavering presence in debate and devotion. Her peers admired her. The clergy respected her. The people revered her. But admiration is not immunity. In a system designed to exclude inclusion is always an anomaly, a disruption disguised as ascension. If she existed, she would be the most extraordinary secret the Church ever kept, not because of her crime, but because of her competence. Centuries later, a single seat in the Vatican is built differently, a carved marble chair with an opening at its center, ostensibly symbolic. Yet it is tied in murmurings and medieval sketches to a strange ritual. Newly elected popes, some say, were required to sit on it, while a designated cleric confirmed their masculinity by touch. Not metaphor, but method, to ensure Joan would remain the last. But who initiated this tradition? And why was it later abandoned? It's not a seat, it's a question cast in stone. In Martin of Opava's 13th century Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum, she appears again fully formed, her papacy recounted as if fact. The Dominican friar wrote not in jest nor fiction, but from the authority of gathered accounts. To him, Joan reigned for over 2 years, betrayed by the one thing her robes could not conceal, a child. Conceived perhaps with a trusted confidant, perhaps with a guard, or perhaps in the most intimate betrayal through rape. No version agrees, every version refrains. But the child is less the scandal than the birth, the moment she ceased being unseen. Was the procession planned to pass near a particular church or a fateful cobblestone where pain seized her? Was it divine punishment or an accident of timing? She collapsed. The crowd gasped, the veil of centuries lifted, and the church responded not with trial, but erasure. The route of that procession, according to lore, was then avoided forever after. No pontiff would walk that cursed path again. A detour etched into ceremonial geography silence turned into ritual. A forgetting made physical. If Joan was myth, then why shape the city to her contours? But perhaps this is not a story about a woman who fooled the world. Perhaps it's a story about a world that could not afford to be fooled. About a system so tightly sealed that even the suggestion of a crack had to be buried beneath layers of tradition, of marble, of selective memory. Historians debate not her existence, but her persistence. Some point to medieval satire carvings of beasts, wearing mitres, women giving sermons, popes with swollen bellies, as evidence of cultural anxiety, not biography. Others counter that satire does not emerge from nothing, that in every jest there is the residue of truth, that stories too widely told become too difficult to dismiss no matter how carefully they are denied. And still no document confirms her, no relic bears her name, no tomb claims her bones. Perhaps that is the point? Perhaps the greatest mark she left is the shape of the absence that followed. In ancient texts, not all ink tells the truth. Some bleeds, some hesitates, some trembles before it touches the parchment. And when you look closely enough at the maps drawn in the margins of history between the certainties between the recorded reigns, you find the letters beginning to falter. The timeline of the papacy, so often presented as seamless, contains these hesitations. One reign ends, another begins, but not always with the immediacy one expects from divine succession. There is occasionally a space, a subtle misalignment, the kind that suggests not error, but intention. Between 855 and 858, the papal records stretch thinner than usual. The Liber Pontificalis, normally eager to document even the smallest deeds, church restorations, acts of charity, letters to distant emperors, becomes subdued. Some editions nearly skip the interval. Others insert Benedict III almost without ceremony. No mention of chaos, no indication of pause. Just a subtle smoothing over. But smoothing requires effort, and effort leaves traces. A manuscript from the monastery of St. Gall lists a John reigning during that time. It is the only name that fits. But there is no context, no deeds, no miracles, just a name placed like a bookmark between two certainties. Later scribes would strike it, overwrite it, or ignore it altogether. Yet the original ink remains beneath the layers a ghost in the fibers of the page. In another account, a scribe writes, Johannes Anglicus, Natione Maguntinus, John the Englishman born in Mainz. No title, no acts, just the whisper of an identity too fragile to remain, as though the pen itself began to hesitate, recognizing the weight of what it might be recording, or erasing. What kind of truth disappears not with fire, but with editing? By the 12th century, chronicles no longer shy away. The tale of Pope Joan moves from suggestion to narrative. Her education in Athens, her disguise, her election, her reign, and her downfall. Chroniclers disagree on the details, dates shift, names twist, locations blur, but they agree on the shape. A papal reign interrupted by birth. And in these retellings, something unsettling emerges. The story is not told with ridicule. Not always. Often it is recounted with resignation. A kind of weary awe, as if the writers themselves are not sure whether to believe it or fear how easily they do. In the margins of a 13th century map of Rome, someone has drawn a small procession figures, in robes, one collapsing to her knees, inked faintly near the Via Sacra, unlabeled, unexplained. The drawing is barely noticeable. You would only see it if you looked beyond the legends past the decorative borders. It does not scream. It whispers. How many such whispers lie beneath the visible lines? And more curiously, why would a tale so easily dismissed as fable persist with such tenacity? Why do modern historians still debate its plausibility? Why did Renaissance thinkers like Platina include it in papal histories only for it to be quietly excised in later printings? An inconvenient lie dies quickly, but a dangerous truth lingers. In 1276, the Dominican Jean de Mailly writes of the Papesse Jeanne, As if her name were a matter of fact, he adds no footnotes, offers no apology. To him, the story is already woven into the ecclesiastical tapestry. And yet, as the Church grows more centralized, more polished in its doctrine, her story begins to fade. Not forgotten, but redacted. And redaction is not forgetting. It is remembering with intent. Today, if you search the official Vatican chronology, she is absent. She is not refuted, not denounced, simply not mentioned. And in the absence of denial, the silence speaks. Not because silence tells you what happened, but because it reveals what must not be said. The papal tiara, with its 3 crowns, was once said to represent the triple authority of the Pope, Father of Kings, Governor of the world, and Vicar of Christ. But crowns, when stacked, grow heavy, not just with meaning, but with weight. Weight that can press down, conceal, and silence. Beneath that towering symbol, robes ripple and feet shuffle across centuries of tradition. Ceremonial processions move through Rome not as acts of motion, but as statements of permanence. The same paths, the same chants, the same rhythm that folds time inward. But there is one route, one quiet stretch of stone, where history may have bent in on itself. The legend says it happened mid-procession. The Pope seated, or walking, depending on the version, moved through the narrow streets between the Colosseum and the Lateran. A sacred path sanctified by repetition. And somewhere near a now-vanished chapel San Clemente, or perhaps San Giovanni in oleo, Poin bloomed. Not metaphorical, but physical. Labor. A rupture between 2 truths, the public mask and the private body. A cry broke out, not of prayer, not of blessing, but of life. The child came too quickly, too publicly, in blood and confusion and shock. Cardinals stared. The crowd fell still. The veil once held in place by belief and tradition was torn suddenly, undeniably in front of all. And in that moment the Church saw its reflection not in glory, but in contradiction. A woman crowned as Pope, a body defying doctrine, a truth too fleshly to ignore. What followed is not recorded in canon law, not preserved in marble or mosaic, but the stories linger like smoke in a sealed chamber. Some say she died there, trampled by the crowd. Others claim she was taken away, imprisoned, buried in secret. A few whisper she lived in exile, cloistered and erased. The Church's response was not trial nor public shaming, but ritual change. No pope would again walk that street. It was declared impure or simply inconvenient. The procession was rerouted, not loudly, not with decree, but by custom. A deviation etched into centuries of practice. The road remained. The memory did not. Or rather, it remained beneath the surface, beneath the stone. Because to avoid a place is also to remember it. In certain medieval texts, the details vary, but one pattern holds: the event is known not for how it happened, but for how it was avoided afterward. A negative space in the choreography of faith. And then there is the sedia stercoraria, the infamous pierced chair, used allegedly during the papal enthronement rite. A pope sits. A cardinal reaches beneath. Verification is performed. Masculinity confirmed. A grotesque ritual, perhaps, or perhaps not. Its first mentions arise only after Joan's legend circulates widely. Coincidence or consequence? What sort of institution adds ceremony not to affirm belief, but to guard against anomaly? Today, the chair is still housed in the Vatican museums. It is labeled art, a curiosity, a Roman latrine mistaken for liturgical furniture, and yet it is carved from porphyry, a stone reserved for emperors. Its placement in early papal consecrations is noted by more than one chronicler, and its function, though disputed, is described with such consistency across regions and languages, it resists easy dismissal. Why explain away what should never have required explanation? Why deny the existence of a ritual unless something once necessitated it? And so the Church keeps walking on new routes with old robes under the same triple crown. But the air along the avoided path still holds its shape. Pilgrims may not know why the procession bends differently, but it does, year after year. A silence built not from absence but from design, like a whisper carefully woven into the hem of a garment. A shepherd's staff is meant to touch the earth. It grounds authority, curves around the lost, steadies the one who walks ahead. In the Church, the papal staff is more than symbol, it is lineage shaped in silver and gold, passed from hand to hand, from century to century. But there is one moment whispered between the folds of tradition when it may never have touched the ground at all. Not because it was dropped, but because the one holding it was never meant to be seen. There are accounts fleeting and unsourced of a certain staff held with hesitation, a crozier that felt too large in its bearer's hands. Not for lack of faith, not for absence of learning, but for the fear that one misstep, one misplacement, would betray the truth beneath the robes. The legend grows quiet here. This is not the part that makes it into chronicles or carvings. It lingers instead in rumors passed among abbots, scribbled in margins by monks, uncertain whether they record blasphemy or warning. They speak of a moment, just one, in which the Pope faltered during the liturgy, a bead of sweat, a shift in balance, the staff that almost fell, and a hand that reached too quickly, too instinctively to catch it, as if weight alone might betray the bearer's nature. No one spoke, no one questioned, but the gaze of the congregation narrowed. And perhaps it was then that suspicion began to coil, not fully formed, not yet accusatory, but present. The papacy, after all, is built on performance. Every gesture, every garment, every silence speaks. There is no room for the unmeasured, no space for trembling. To be pope is to move with certainty, to never seem unsure, and so the staff must never waver again. In the years following Joan's alleged reign, ritual stiffened, movements codified. The process of selection became more scrutinized, layers of ceremonial vetting added. Some said it was to preserve purity. Others understood it was to prevent recurrence. One bishop, centuries later, remarked on the increasing rigidity of papal rites, how what had once been fluid, deeply human, had become almost theatrical, as though the stage must now be protected from any intrusion, as though the memory of what once slipped through still haunted the script. And yet the story was not suppressed immediately. In medieval universities, scholars debated Joan's existence alongside the fall of Rome and the nature of divine grace. Students copied her story into marginalia. Artists carved her image into cathedral reliefs, not glorifying, but not mocking either. She stood between allegory and accusation. In Siena, a series of busts depicting all the popes once included a female figure, labeled simply Ioanna. Not crowned, not adorned, just there, still. By the 16th century she had been replaced, chiseled away, repainted. The official timeline closed again. But time does not erase what memory shelters. In Poland, in Bohemia, in parts of southern France, her story lived on through plays, through ballads, through the whispered corrections of grandmothers to their grandchildren. Not written, not taught, but transmitted. Like a relic too fragile for display, passed from hand to hand beneath the folds of fabric. And the staff, it returned to certainty. Today it glints with unshaken weight in the hands of men sworn to uphold an unbroken line. It is polished, balanced, rehearsed. No one stumbles. No one falters. And if they do, it is quickly explained away. Fatigue, illness, reverence. But in that one moment long ago, if it ever was, the staff hovered above the earth, suspended, untethered, and the shadow it cast did not align with the light. There are places built not just to house power, but to echo it. The Lateran Palace was once such a place. Before the Vatican, before the Sistine splendor and the marble vastness of St. Peter's, it was the Lateran that breathed papal command. Its halls held councils. Its walls bore witness. Its tower silent now once heard the voices of popes speaking into stone. But echoes require something to return. Almness, and there is a moment in its history when sound for once did not come back. The story drifts from Rome's corners past crumbled aqueducts and alleys choked with jasmine and dust. In one telling, a pope retires briefly from view. Illness, perhaps, or contemplation. Days pass, then weeks. The court waits, but no blessing is issued, no audience held, no edict signed. The bell does not toll, and the tower, accustomed to reverberation, remains still. Some say the chamber was lit, but the curtains remained drawn. Others claim the papal garments were sent out for mending not from wear, but from blood. There are no records, of course, only gaps, only the narrowing eyes of scribes who found their pages lighter than expected. What kind of silence settles over the Lateran? Not the silence of sleep, not even that of mourning, but the kind that spreads when language itself falters, when even the faithful dare not speak what the stones already know. One theory whispered centuries later suggests the woman called John Anglicus was concealed there after her unveiling. Not as prisoner, not quite. More like a relic that must not be seen. A living contradiction entombed in protocol. She did not preach, she did not appear, she waited, and the tower waited with her. A tower becomes a confession booth when no one leaves it. Some architectural historians note strange alterations to one wing of the Lateran during the 9th century. Reinforced walls, sealed doors, a chamber documented briefly in an estate record, then omitted in later inventories. The room is not marked today, but the blueprints exist, one drawn by a German architect in the 17th century, unearthed in a private archive in 1928, then quietly reburied. Why restore what was never allowed to exist? The Lateran basilica itself bears no inscription to her, but a mosaic above one apse depicts a shepherd, eyes closed, holding a lamb that looks not outward but back. A rare pose, inverted. No citation, no patron recorded. Just a signature now eroded, traced once in gold tesserae now gone. Some say the lamb is meant to be Christ, others that it is simply art. But what if it is not a symbol at all, but a witness? The woman in the tower, if she lived, left no sermon, no prayer, no final words, only silence stretched so wide it became structure. The papal court resumed its functions. A new name filled the records. A new voice echoed through the basilica, but not through the tower, because sometimes to keep truth from rising again, you must leave part of the building hollow. Centuries pass, the tower remains. Visitors tour. Its base admire its stones, trace fingers along its ancient stairs. But few linger. Few ask why the upper levels are sealed. Most do not know they exist. A plaque explains it as structural fatigue, a term that means nothing but also perhaps means too much. Fatigue is not always physical. Sometimes it is memory that gives way. And so the Lateran stands echoless in one place, lightless in one corner, as though history, having once said too much, decided to say nothing ever again. A liturgy is more than words. It is rhythm, repetition, the measured breath of centuries passed from tongue to tongue like a sacrament. To sing a hymn is to echo the divine, to reaffirm the unbroken line. But sometimes a note falls out of favor, not for lack of beauty, but because it remembers something best left unsung. One such hymn existed. Not famous, not glorious. Just a few stanzas tucked in the margins of a 9th century missal discovered centuries later in a Benedictine archive near Regensburg. Faded ink, diminished script, a melody marked with neumes no longer decipherable in full. But the words, they lingered. Vox clamantis in vestitu altero non vir, non femina sed veritas. A voice cries out in other clothing, not man, not woman, but truth. It does not name, it does not accuse, but it does not conform. Scholars debated its origin. Some claimed it was a monastic metaphor, a meditation on the duality of the soul. Others suggested it referenced the early desert hermits whose lives defied easy categorization. But the dating mid-9th century made the coincidence uneasy, especially since the hymn appeared only in a single known manuscript, never copied, never cited. And after that, one entry never included in any rite again. Why write a hymn only once? Why preserve it in a book otherwise filled with repetition? One possibility, it was sung, quietly, briefly in some chapel where memory had not yet been cauterized. Perhaps a lone monk or a group of clerics who believed not in rebellion but in remembrance. Not to honor what happened, but to name what had been made invisible. Music, after all, is harder to censor than prose. A note hummed under breath can carry farther than an argument shouted aloud. A chant echoes down cloisters long after the voice has left. And yet this hymn did not spread, did not endure. Its notation was crossed out in later editions, the parchment scrubbed, the staff lines removed, a red wax seal placed across the page. Nulla auctoritas, no authority. Not incorrect, not false, just without permission. Later, theologians would classify it among apocryphal rites, not dangerous, but unnecessary. And in liturgy, the unnecessary is a liability, because anything that does not serve the stability of belief invites rupture. Even silence must be curated. The same manuscript contains an odd marginal illustration, a figure with one foot cloaked, the other bare. Neither male nor female in form. Eyes closed. Mouth open. The staff in their hand points not upward, but downward to the ground, or perhaps to something beneath it. The caption beneath reads, Eravit in carne sed non in lumine. She erred in flesh, but not in light. The line is untraceable, not from Scripture, not from any known hymn. It exists solely here in the margin of the forgotten. As if someone tried just once to say what had been carefully left unsaid. And so the hymn remains unsung. Not forbidden, not burned, just buried in paperwork and parchment, wrapped in centuries of quiet neglect. Like a relic lost not in war or fire but in filing. Even today that page draws no pilgrimage. No liturgical scholar cites it with confidence. Most leave it footnoted at best, a curiosity, a fragment, an unresolved stanza. But unresolved stanzas tend to hum in the mind longer than the complete ones, because the hymns we forget are often the ones that remembered too much. Time in official records is supposed to move cleanly. Names follow names. Years unfold in proper order. Each papal reign, no matter how brief, is catalogued, numbered, inscribed, weighed in miracles or missteps. But somewhere between Benedict III and John VIII, the pages hesitate. Not torn, not missing. Simply quiet. A space opens where continuity should have been. Benedict III, consecrated in 855, reigned for 6 years. John VIII followed in 872. The math should align, but it doesn't. Between their two names, between the end of one man's rule and the beginning of another's rise, there are lines, blurred reigns contested, and a shadow so thin it almost goes unnoticed. Almost. There is mention briefly in the Annales Fuldenses of a crisis in Rome, a delay in coronation, interference from Emperor Louis II. The suggestion is political tensions, not mysteries, and yet the timing matches other murmurs that during this moment of uncertainty, a pontiff held the chair who left no mark, no seal, no monument, or rather whose mark was removed. Some historians attribute the confusion to the brief appearance of anti-pope Anastasius, a man supported by the imperial faction, installed briefly before being cast aside. His name remains in some lists footnoted, asterisked, acknowledged, but discredited. But even that explanation leaves a residue. The timeline still stretches thin, still wobbles. What if the name recorded Anastasius was a placeholder, a substitution, a convenient mask for someone even more inconvenient? What if the true disruption was not an imperial puppet, but a woman in papal robes? In some 11th century German chronicles, there appears a reference to a papa inter duo nullus, a pope between two uncounted. The phrase is dismissed by most as scribal error, a copyist's confusion, but it appears more than once across manuscripts with no known connection. The phrase never names, it only signals. A ghost space, a breath held by history. Why would multiple sources acknowledge a figure they do not name? There is another anomaly. The Liber Pontificalis, Rome's official papal register, includes detailed biographies for nearly every pope of the early Middle Ages. But Benedict III's entry is notably sparse. John VIII's, by contrast, is extensive. As if after silence the pen rushed to affirm certainty again. The overcorrection of narrative. In architecture, too, there is a discontinuity. A niche in the Basilica of St. Cecilia, bricked over hastily during the mid-9th century, was long thought to be structural reinforcement. But a restoration in 1974 revealed frescoes beneath partially destroyed of a papal figure seated not on a throne, but on a low stool, hands folded, head bare. The inscription below, Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. Unusual, the humility is excessive even for monastic art. No tiara, no symbols of masculinity, Only that single phrase and the folds of robes that seemed too soft, too loosely drawn. The fresco was recovered, not out of reverence, but to avoid interpretive confusion. How much confusion must a wall cause before it is hidden again? Some claim this missing time is explained by overlapping reigns, that co-popes' disputed elections and fragmented records are simply the natural mess of medieval rule. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps. But it is precisely in the mess that truth slips in. Unseen, unacknowledged, but present. A woman reigning quietly, too briefly to root herself in stone, too reverently to incite rebellion, long enough to be remembered in whispers, not by name, but by the silence that followed her. And when John VIII is finally crowned, it is as if the Church exhales again, not because normalcy returns, but because the interruption is past. Because history, like ritual, can tolerate error. But never ambiguity. The Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes, is not a story. It is a ledger, a quiet, persistent litany of facts. It tells of birthplaces, reign durations, donations, churches restored, relics enshrined. It speaks without flourish, without doubt. Its voice is dry, measured, final. But even in such a voice, erasure leaves fingerprints. One manuscript copied in the early 10th century and preserved in the Abbey of St. Gall contains an unusual mark. A long horizontal scrape across half a line, its vellum still faintly indented beneath the abrasion. Under magnification, a few letters remain visible, just enough to suggest what was once there: Inter Leo et Benedictus sedit. Between Leo and Benedict sat. The rest is gone. Removed not hastily but carefully, as if the scribe had not made an error but had been instructed to unwrite something already agreed upon. Why not simply omit the name altogether? Why write it in only to strike it out? Erasure is different from silence. It implies something once spoken. Other copies of the Liber, copied decades or centuries later, flow seamlessly from Pope Leo XIV to Pope Benedict III. No hesitation, no gap, no mention of a pontificate in between. But the earlier version, now held in fragments at the Zentral Bibliothek in Zurich, preserves just enough to disrupt the illusion, a papal name lost by intention. Across Europe, in parallel, texts chronicles, regnal lists ecclesiastical histories. There are moments when the name Johannes appears where it should not, sometimes without context, sometimes embedded in lines that make little sense. In a 12th century Breton codex, an entry for the year 856 reads simply Pontificatus mulieris retectus est. The woman's pontificate was revealed. Revealed, not begun, not ended, but uncovered. As if it had been ongoing, as if it had already taken root. The Church never officially recognized such a figure, but recognition and remembrance are not the same. One is sanctioned. The other leaks. In 1245, when the Chronica Minor of Engelbert of Admont catalogued the popes, he included a footnote beside Benedict III. There was a woman, some say, but she is no longer counted. Not denied. Not mocked. Simply not counted. Counting is a sacred act in Rome. To number a pope is to place him within the unbroken line to confirm his legitimacy, not only in time, but in doctrine. Even anti-popes receive numbers, names, and placement, albeit marked as false. But to not count at all, that is more than denial. That is deletion. And yet beneath that deletion the structure creaks. In the 17th century, Protestant scholars seized upon the Pope Joan narrative as evidence of Catholic corruption, using it not to explore mystery, but to indict. In response, the Vatican grew louder in its denials. The tale they insisted was fiction, a satire gone too far, misread legend, political tool. But with each denial came renewed interest, and with each interest another text surfaced, another anomaly in the timeline, another marginal note, a record of a donation made by Johannes without numeral or origin, a carving of a seated figure whose features had been smoothed flat by chisel, a reference in a 15th century sermon to the lesson of the interregnum. Even the papal numbering itself bears the trace. There is no Pope Joan 16th. The sequence skips from John 16th to John 25th. Historians blame clerical error, confusion in manuscripts, misnumbering, and yet the skip remains untouched for centuries, uncorrected, a small stutter in the sacred count. It is said that God counts every hair on a person's head. But what does it mean when his vicar loses track of one name? The Liber Pontificalis endures. It still sits on shelves, still forms the backbone of every ecclesiastical timeline. But those who know where to look, who tilt the page toward the right light, can still see the shadow of that scraped line. The ghost of the sentence that once said too much. A book of certainties with one uncertain scar. And the scar speaks louder than the ink. Stones remember. They do not speak, but they do not forget. Along the Via Sacra, the sacred way, thousands of feet have passed robes, sweeping dust hooves, pounding rhythm candles flickering against fading walls. Beneath each step lies the weight of ritual. But between those ancient slabs, one is said to have been smoothed not by time, but by collapse. There is a place near the curve between the Colosseum and the Basilica of San Clemente, where the procession path once turned. It is unmarked now. Tourists walk it without knowing. No plaque, no shrine, just a seam in the stone, where two slabs do not align. A slight dip. Barely visible, but felt. The legend says it was here she fell. The papal procession was never casual. It was a deliberate movement through Rome's most sacred artery, a reminder of authority, of divine order. The Pope rode or walked flanked by clergy, surrounded by silence and incense, a performance of infallibility. But that day, if it happened, one figure stumbled, not from weakness, but from labor. Her body held in secrecy for years beneath vestments, and vow could no longer be contained. In the swell of pain and fluid and hidden life, the illusion ruptured. Eyewitnesses, if they existed, would have seen not a pope, but a woman in childbirth. And not in shadowed chambers, but beneath the open sky, on consecrated stone, mid-procession. The cries of birth drowned the chants. Some accounts say the crowd recoiled. Others that they watched in stunned reverence, unable to process what had torn their belief in two. The guards hesitated. The cardinals froze. No liturgical script covered this moment. No precedent. She was unnamed. She was untaught. She was unthinkable. There are no official reports of a papal collapse in this spot. But for centuries afterward, the route was altered. Quietly. The excuse was safety. Urban congestion. Strategic rearrangement of holy sites. But the timing just after Benedict III's early years suggests more. As if something happened along that stretch of stone too jarring to include, but too sacred to repeat. A few early maps mark it with a symbol, a broken circle like a sun partially eclipsed. On one, a monk's annotation reads, Ubi terra tremuit, where the earth trembled. But no earthquake is recorded. Perhaps the tremor came not from the ground, but from belief. They say a shrine once stood there, temporary, built in secrecy, a place for silent penitence. No mass was said, no names invoked, just an arch with a veil hanging in its center. Visitors would enter, touch the veil, and leave. Nothing more. By the 11th century it had vanished. No trace remains, except the stone, one slab more worn than the others, almost polished, as if countless hands touched it in passing, as if they knew even without knowing that something had unfolded there, something that should never have been seen. In 1452, during a road repair ordered by Pope Nicholas V, a small cavity beneath that stretch was uncovered. The workers found fragments, cloth, bone, wood. No inscription, no relic case. The items were burned. But one foreman in a letter never sent described what he saw. Preserved now only in transcript, a basin of marble shattered, a sandal too small for a man, and a strand of hair caught on a nail. He sealed the letter, titled it Memoria del Silenzio, Memory of Silence. The procession still exists. Popes still walk or ride. Incense still burns. But they turn differently now. Their steps arc gently away from the dip in the stone. No one explains it. No one notices. Yet the earth there is softer, as if it once bore weight not meant to be carried, and never quite let it go. Rituals like relics carry weight beyond reason. Their repetition is supposed to create comfort, a familiarity that silences doubt. But some rituals are born not from devotion, but from fear. Some are not meant to reveal the divine, but to conceal what once disrupted it. There is one such rite, known by few, whispered by many, recounted in tones that waver between derision and dread. A ritual of verification, of touch. After the election of a new pope, he was to be seated, so the legend goes, on a chair carved from red porphyry, ancient and cold. The seat was hollowed open beneath. Beneath it knelt a cardinal or deacon. His role was not symbolic. It was anatomical. He reached up. He touched. And then solemnly he declared testiculos habet et bene pendentes. He has testicles, and they hang well. A moment of absurdity dressed in ceremonial robes. It has been dismissed as myth, as satire, as grotesque anti-clerical invention. And yet the chair exists. Two of them, in fact. One resides in the Vatican museums, another at the Lateran. Both made of porphyry, a material reserved for emperors. Both shaped with a curious void, and both officially designated as Roman latrine thrones, repurposed, misunderstood, misidentified. But no Roman latrine was ever shaped like this, and no ordinary chair was placed at the heart of a rite that vanished without explanation. Because rites do not vanish unless they threaten something. The ceremony, if it happened, was brief, public in the sense that it occurred before witnesses, but not spoken of, not recorded in official manuals. It passed through oral transmission, through the hushed laughter of cardinals and the dry humor of monks. But beneath the jest was anxiety. Because if one woman could ascend the throne of St. Peter, once it could happen again. And so a new layer was added to the investiture, not in theology but in flesh. The touch became theology. From the 13th century, onward documents begin to make vague reference to confirmatio corporis, not explained, not detailed. But it appears in the margins of conclave procedures scribbled beside more sacred instructions. Then, by the 17th century, the phrase disappears entirely, as if the ritual no longer useful or no longer bearable was folded away. Some say the last time it was performed was during the papacy of Leo VI. Others claim it continued informally behind closed doors, masked as medical examination. But no liturgical text includes it. No official pronouncement condemns it. And that perhaps is the strangest part. Most superstitions are denounced. Most false rites are named and rejected. But this one is simply not mentioned, as though to speak of it would be to breathe life into something too fragile to survive scrutiny, or too true to remain safe. In 1994, a liturgical historian studying papal enthronement rites came across a set of illustrations from a 15th century French manuscript. Hidden among them, a depiction of a seated pope robes lifted slightly with a kneeling figure beneath the chair. The faces are expressionless. The caption reads only Custodia Pontificis, the protection of the Pope. Protection from what? From error, or from memory. The Church today calls the chair a curiosity, a relic of imperial Rome, misunderstood, misnamed. But the placement of such a seat in the Lateran and its alignment with papal coronation chambers invites more than mere coincidence. Some things are hidden not because they are false, but because they are too easily believed. The rite may be gone. The chair may be dry and cracked. But the silence that replaced the touch is no less invasive. It reaches further. It reshapes history not by denial, but by omission. A gesture once performed in panic became tradition. Then the tradition was buried in stone. On the Calabrian coast, where cliffs lean into the sea and stone crumbles into mist, there lies a town called Tropea. It is quiet now, a place of narrow stairs and salt-blown shutters. But beneath its serenity, beneath its churches and cellars, is a darkness carved by centuries, a well, they say, that never ran dry. Not with water, but with memory. They call it the Pope's Well. Though no pope is buried there, no pope was born there. Officially, Tropea has no claim to the papal line. And yet for generations, pilgrims came not with prayers, but with questions. Not for healing, but for silence. At the center of the old monastery of Santa Maria dell'Isola, long before it became a postcard ruin, there was a cistern, brick-lined, narrow, and at its bottom something was once hidden. No record describes what. Only a passage in an anonymous 17th century traveler's journal. The monks will not speak of it, but I have seen the well. They say a finger was found there wrapped in linen, still whole though no body remained. A finger! Small, pale, preserved beyond nature's kindness. It could have belonged to anyone, to no one, but the story grew. In some tellings, it was adorned with a thin gold ring. In others, it clutched a piece of thread crimson unraveling. But the detail that never changed, never shifted with the years, was that it was found in silence. No announcement, no procession, just unearthed in a moment of repairs and reburied just as quickly. Why would monks in a coastal town conceal a fragment of flesh? And why would they whisper quietly, always quietly, that it belonged to a pope who had no grave? Rome claims to bury every pontiff, even anti-popes, even those disgraced. Their tombs may shift, their markers fade, but the record remains. Papal flesh does not simply vanish. unless it was never meant to be found. Unless it was never meant to be there. Tropea's well was sealed in the 1800s after an earthquake cracked the foundation. The structure above it collapsed. Reconstruction buried it deeper. Today, visitors walk the gardens above it unaware. The monastery is a viewpoint, a photo stop. But in 1959, during a brief restoration, workers discovered a piece of linen lodged between bricks near the sealed shaft. Faded, fragile, tested later, and found to be dyed with iron-rich pigment blood, perhaps though too degraded for confirmation. It was catalogued, then misplaced. Some claimed it was filed under medieval cloth fragments. Others believe it was quietly claimed by the church. Either way, it vanished again. Like the rest of her. The connection to Pope Joan, never spoken, only insinuated, was too delicate, too absurd. A woman Pope's finger buried in a forgotten well in Calabria. It stretched belief. It begged dismissal. But it persisted. Because the well remained. Because silence draws more than it repels. There are still locals who avoid the monastery at night. They say the air near the sealed stones grows colder after sundown. That dogs refuse to drink from the nearby fountain. That the dust there clings too long to your skin. One elderly woman interviewed in the 1980s recalled her grandmother's tale that the well once held a body. That the body was not clothed as a monk or a soldier, but in linen and lace. Not buried, but hidden. Lowered gently, as if placed with care, and that when they could no longer keep it, they left only the finger as a warning, or a memory. She could not explain how her grandmother knew. She only whispered, "The church cannot bury what it never named." And so the well stays sealed. But sometimes the earth remembers what the pages do not. And sometimes even a finger can point toward what history refused to hold. Marble does not lie easily. It endures even when the hands that shaped it are long dust. Statues hold memory in gesture, in posture, in silence. They do not speak, yet they say too much. And sometimes that is the danger. They say there was once a statue in Rome carved not for reverence nor for beauty, but for something else entirely. It stood on a narrow street between the old theater of Marcellus and the church of Santa Maria in Campitelli. A place neither central nor hidden, just out of the way enough to be forgotten, until it wasn't. The statue was called La Papessa. No inscription. No plaque, just a robed figure seated not on a throne, but on a simple stone chair. One hand rested on her lap. The other cradled a child. The face, gentle, blank, androgynous, was said to change in the shifting light. From certain angles she looked like a man, from others unmistakably female. Locals did not speak of her often, but they nodded when asked. "She's the one who should not have been an old Roman," once said to a traveler in 1723. But marble does not care about rules. Art historians have searched for records of such a sculpture. None exist. No tax ledger lists its commission. No church inventory mentions it. But travelers' journals from the 15th to the 18th centuries contain passing references. A woman pope rendered in stone, the Madonna with the child, yet crowned unlike any other, a likeness that stirs unease in those who do not know her name. Then sometime in the late 1600s she vanished. Not destroyed, not relocated, simply gone. A French bishop passing through in 1699 noted her presence, even described the child in her arms as holding a small orb, perhaps a globe, or a communion wafer. But 20 years later, an English diplomat traced her steps, and found nothing. Only a blank wall where the pedestal had once been. No debris, no fragments, as if she had never been there at all. What sort of sculpture disappears without breaking? There are whispers, of course, that the church ordered its removal under cover of darkness, that a team of masons dismantled her piece by piece and reburied her somewhere outside the city walls, that she now lies in a forgotten crypt beneath the Janiculum Hill. But no proof remains, only a series of strange gaps in the map. City registries from the 17th century describe a statua ignota, an unknown statue without context, a vague mention of ecclesiastical complaint, a marginal note forma non conveniens, form not appropriate. The statue's existence or absence became a kind of test. Those who spoke of it too clearly were dismissed as romantics or liars. Those who refused to acknowledge it were trusted. And yet her image lingers. In one 1472 woodcut held now in a private archive in Bruges, a female figure in papal robes sits beside a collapsed pillar. The caption reads, Ecclesia turbata, sed non perdita. The church disturbed, but not lost. The woodcut bears no author's name, no date, but in the folds of the robe, in the slight tilt of the head, scholars have found echoes of descriptions of la papessa, almost exact. So why depict her? Why immortalize what must be denied? Because some truths are more powerful as shadows. When confined to marble, they remain static. But once broken, once whispered, they multiply. There are some who claim the statue was never real, that it was a metaphor mistaken for stone, that people saw what they feared the embodiment of disruption carved into permanence. But statues are not metaphors. They weigh too much, and even when removed, their absence carries the same gravity. Today, where she once stood there, is a modern trash bin, a metal box chained to a pole. People pass it every day unaware. The wall behind it is stained with rain, but smooth, too smooth, as if scraped clean, as if a story once stood there and someone wanted no one to remember how it looked. A woman in the flesh of Roman authority, that was the phrase, whispered like blasphemy behind monastery walls. Not in jest, not in admiration, but in fear. Because flesh was never meant to sit on the throne of St. Peter, unless it had been born in a certain shape, moved in a certain way, and sounded in a certain voice. Anything else was an error, or a heresy. And yet for a span of years, two perhaps more, a woman may have sat in the very seat carved for the Vicar of Christ. Not in disguise, but in full assumption of the role, with mitre, with ring, with blessing, with belief. There were no laws against it then. The canons forbade much, but they had never considered this. The idea was unthinkable enough not to be legislated. And when a thing is not forbidden, it can for a brief moment exist, before the machine of doctrine closes again. No one who served under her, if they did ever spoke of the deception. No written confession survives. No bitter rival recorded her mistake. Only silence and the slow stitching of a narrative where her shape could not fit. She was erased not with fire, but with compliance. But compliance leaves edges. In the Archbasilica of St. John, Lateran, among its many chapels, there is one altar unlike the rest. Its marble is duller, its carvings faint. The inscription above it reads only, "In memoriam Dei famulae," in memory of God's handmaid. No name, no relics, just a slab. Some say the altar was repurposed, that it once bore another dedication. Others believe it was always meant to remain vague, a placeholder, a tribute without context, because naming a woman who ruled as Pope would validate her, but failing to mark her at all would leave the structure of memory too brittle. So the Church perhaps compromised. A handmaid of God buried without voice, buried, some claim, beneath that very altar. A theory, of course, nothing more. But in 1963, during routine preservation work, engineers found an unexpected cavity below the floor. Not a crypt too shallow, not a drainage channel too precise, just a sealed box of stone large enough for a body. They were not permitted to open it. Papal remains, they were told, could not be disturbed. But there was no record of a pope interred there. No record at all. Later requests for excavation were denied. The floor was resealed. The work undocumented. The chapel closed for 5 years officially due to moisture damage. When it reopened, nothing had changed, except the rumors, because flesh, when it enters the sacred, does not evaporate. It leaves impressions, oils in wood, dust in crevices, the pressure of presence on seat and vestment. You cannot erase a body from a space it once occupied without changing the space itself. Even the garments carry memory. There are tales of a papal alb stored deep within the vaults beneath the apostolic palace, stitched in a pattern unknown to any male pontiff. Narrower sleeves. A hem reworked to allow freer movement. No emblem, no coat of arms, just linen and thread. The Vatican calls it an artifact of no known origin. Its label reads simply unattributed 9th century. Not hidden, not displayed, just resting as if waiting. A woman in papal flesh is an impossibility by today's rules. But rules are not truth. They are the architecture built to contain truth. And every architecture bears a flaw, a hairline fracture beneath the polish. She was the fracture. Not loud, not violent, just enough to remind the edifice that it is made by hands. And hands are always fallible. Perhaps that is why her body, if it was buried, was left unnamed, not as punishment, but as a warning that even the perfect circle of apostolic succession once bent under the weight of something unplanned, and the stone remembers that bend. Even now, blood in a cathedral is not rare. Saints bled, martyrs bled. Even the faithful on knees long pressed to stone sometimes leave crimson behind. But papal blood is different. It is veiled in sacrament wrapped in silk. It does not spill. It is not seen. Except once they say, it ran backward across the floor of a church that had no name for the moment. A place between sanctity and scandal. The tale fragmented, fading places it during a morning mass. The Pope mid-benediction. Incense drifting in slow spirals. The choir in its second verse. And then a pause, a falter in the voice. The weight of something more than fatigue. She stepped back, or stumbled. The altar boys turned, one ran. The others froze, and then the sound not of collapse, but of rupture. A wet gasp swallowed by stone. Blood not pooled but traced following the grooves between the marble tiles. Not forward toward the nave but backward, retreating, as if the body did not fall but was pulled, as if history itself was trying to undo what had just occurred. They say no one moved for a moment. Even the bells those ever-faithful witnesses of Rome did not ring. There is no record of this in the liturgical annals, no marginalia in the Book of Hours, but a single page preserved in the private archive of a northern Italian monastery tells of a sanguis sacrilegus, sacrilegious blood found on the sanctuary floor, unaccompanied by martyrdom or death. The page is unsigned, the ink water-damaged, but the words are precise. The blood was real, but the source was unspeakable. Later scribes would scratch it out, but the phrase bled through the parchment, faint but permanent. Church custodians, those silent caretakers, were summoned. The blood was washed not once, but 3 times, each time with a different mixture, holy water, salt, vinegar, then lime, then silence. The tiles were replaced, not because they were cracked, but because they had remembered too well. In the 1930s, a team of conservators restoring the floor of the basilica found a curious misalignment tiles that had once been lifted and relaid centuries earlier. The stone beneath bore discoloration, microscopic traces of iron-rich residue consistent with blood. Too old to date, too little to trace. The report was buried in technical archives, but one engineer made a note in the margin. Pattern suggests backward flow. Impossible. Blood does not flow backward, unless something deeper pulls it. The site, if it was the Lateran or perhaps a lesser chapel, was never named. The identity of the celebrant was never written. But local memory has a different precision. Old women still speak of the red morning, not with scandal, with caution, as if saying too much might wake something meant to stay buried. They touch their rosaries differently when passing that side of the church, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. One historian granted access to unclassified Vatican architectural records noted an unusual feature beneath the altar of a now demolished chapel. There existed a drainage channel, curved narrow, unconnected to any fountain or roof, designed, it seems, not to direct water, but to carry something away discreetly. No explanation is offered. No diagram included. Just the line of a channel running back into the earth. Perhaps it was for rain. Perhaps it was for memory. Because when history tries to forget, the ground does not. And when blood touches stone, the stone does not absolve. It absorbs. Beneath the Vatican, under centuries of sanctified stone and shadowed gold, there is a city of the dead. Not metaphor, not myth. A real necropolis, layered, sealed, unearthed, and unearthed again. Its corridors are narrow, its ceilings low. The bones sleep in niches and marble sarcophagi in earth packed hard with time. Most graves bear names: Peter, Pius, Innocent, Leo. Saints, popes, martyrs, all etched into slabs with care, with Latin reverence. Even those fallen from favor are recorded labeled as anti-popes, but not erased. And yet among these tombs lie several with no inscriptions. Not damaged, not weathered, just blank. A silence too precise to be accidental. Archaeologists who walk these halls speak cautiously. They catalogue. They speculate. But some avoid a small row of vaults near the far western edge of the necropolis, behind a sealed grate with no public tour. There, tucked into the curve of the corridor, are 3 stone coffins, all identical, all unmarked. No symbols, no names, no Christian iconography. Only a faint carving on the central lid, a single key pointing downward. Not the twin keys of St. Peter, not the upward gesture of salvation, just one key, tilted toward the earth. Some believe these are ordinary burials. forgotten clergy, minor patrons, but others quietly only in closed circles propose something else, that the unmarked graves do not reflect loss, but refusal, a denial deeper than rejection, the kind that cloaks a body in concrete anonymity. In 1972, a team surveying ground moisture beneath the basilica used ground-penetrating radar to scan these vaults. What they found was expected skeletal remains well preserved, but the central coffin revealed something curious, shoulder width narrower than the others. Bone density inconsistent with the male samples nearby. A pelvis that by all biological metrics belonged to a woman. The report was labeled inconclusive. The data stored, the scan repeated. 3 years later, the Vatican restricted access to the corridor. Preservation concerns, they said. Structural instability. But stone does not forget what it was built to guard. A Jesuit scholar writing anonymously in a forbidden tract once called these graves the Triple Lock. He believed the Church had sealed not a heretic, not a scandal, but a paradox. A body that broke doctrine not by choice, but by existence. A woman who had spoken the Mass, given the blessing, worn the tiara. Not as a rebel, but as Pope. To exhume her would be to name her. To name her would be to unravel the certainty that had been curated with such precision. For if one woman had sat upon the throne undeniably flesh and breath, then the line of succession is not only interrupted, it is made porous, and so the grave remains untouched. Not protected, not honored, just unmentioned. In the chapel above, the faithful kneel daily unaware of the body that may lie beneath. A body that once stood at the altar raised the chalice, spoke the words, Hoc est enim corpus meum. This is my body. But no one remembers her voice now. No prayer carries her name. No feast day marks her memory. Only the blank tomb remains, and in that blankness a weight deeper than marble. Because when you bury a truth without a marker, you do not silence it. You give it a deeper place to echo from. When something cannot be proven, the Church often tolerates it. When it cannot be disproven, it becomes dangerous. Somewhere in the quiet corridors of medieval canon law, an unofficial rule took root, not written, not decreed, but followed with unwavering precision, do not name her. Not in sermon, not in teaching, not in jest, not even to deny. Let the silence close around the tale like wax sealing a scroll never meant to be read. And for a while it worked. But silence, when drawn too tight, begins to hum. By the 13th century, she had returned not in doctrine, but in legend. She surfaced in the margins of chronicles, the chants of minstrels, the satirical woodcuts pressed into the hands of pilgrims, not as Pope Joan, not yet, but as the papessa, the she-pope, the blasphemy wrapped in robes. They told it differently in every land. In Germany she was born in Mainz, brilliant and pious crossing into Rome, disguised as a monk. In France, she was seduced by the devil and tricked into pregnancy. In England, she was a scholar of unmatched wisdom, chosen not by deception, but by divine mistake. Her death changed too stoned by crowds crushed beneath her horse taken by angels. The facts bent, but the shape remained. A woman, a child, a throne, and then a rupture. The earliest printed editions of Martin of Opava's Chronicon included her story as fact, no hedging, no irony. She reigned for over 2 years, was beloved, was betrayed by her own body. His account was copied, cited, believed. It spread faster than any edict. But by the 16th century, As the Reformation cracked the Church along lines of doubt and fire, Joan's tale became a weapon. Protestants clutched it as proof of Rome's corruption, a church so blind it crowned a woman by mistake, or so depraved it covered it up without repentance. The Vatican's silence grew harder, sharper. It was no longer enough to omit. Now it must be erased. In 1601, under Clement VIII, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned books, quietly included works that referenced her too clearly. Printers redacted passages. Historians revised timelines. Illustrations were scrubbed clean. One Jesuit scholar wrote that even mentioning the legend was to open the door to serpents. And yet the door never closed. The tarot deck in its earliest Italian forms included a card named La Papessa. Seated veiled holding a book, not a nun, not a queen, something in between. She bore no number, no suit, only the title. Later decks renamed her the High Priestess. But the image endured. Why would a card game carry a heresy in its heart? Because stories find their way where doctrine cannot reach. A convent in Bohemia preserved a play from the 1400s, Lamentatio Papacy, in which a pope gives birth, alone speaks to the Virgin, and fades into mist. The manuscript was found centuries later, hidden in the lining of a reliquary. The ink had bled through cloth. Elsewhere in Spain, a folk song tells of the Pope of Sorrow, a woman who ruled for 9 moons and 9 prayers, then vanished during an eclipse. No mention of names, only the rhythm of shame and awe. Even in Rome, statues whispered. In the 1700s, tour guides pointed to a sculpture now long gone and muttered, "That is where she wept, not as history, as ritual, as performance." The Vatican never issued an official refutation, never convened a council to condemn the myth. That would mean acknowledging its power, and so the story existed between the lines. Too impure for belief, too persistent for denial. And in that strange tension she flourished. Because what cannot be said aloud grows deeper in the soul. She became not just a woman, not just a pope, but the space between certainty and confession, the breath the Church would not take. And legends, when deprived of names, grow roots in places far beyond reach. Cloisters are built to hold silence, thick walls, high arches, rooms turned inward. In these quiet enclosures, time folds in on itself. The world fades, and with it, noise. But silence is not absence. In the oldest convents of Europe, it becomes a kind of language, spoken in gesture, preserved in ritual, guarded by those who understand what must be hidden to survive. In these spaces, the name Joan was never spoken, but her shape moved in shadows. Nuns, especially in enclosed orders, were forbidden from preaching, from teaching theology, from interpreting scripture aloud. They were bodies without voice, brides of Christ who could not speak in his house, and yet in manuscript illuminations, in patterns stitched into altar cloths, in the positioning of candles at certain masses, her echo appeared. One altar in Alsace, hidden in a side chapel of an Augustinian convent, depicts a veiled figure in papal robes, slightly off-scale, smaller than the others. No name, no halo. She holds a book closed. Her eyes, too, are shut. The inventory lists her simply as woman unknown holding wisdom. In Ireland, in the ruins of a Benedictine priory, scholars found a marginal note in a psalter. She knew the Mass. She was not allowed. Still she knew. The hand is old, feminine, no attribution, but the ink remains steady. Across Europe, these threads form a silent network, not of belief, perhaps, but of recognition. They did not call her saint. They did not call her pope. They simply did not forget her. One nun writing in the 14th century, in what is now Belgium, composed a meditation on the hidden face of knowledge. The figure she describes is cloaked, seated surrounded by men whose faces are blurred. She wears no crown, but she holds a ring. She is not silence, the nun writes. She is silenced. These women were not rebels. They were obedient. They followed their rules, recited their hours, bound their texts. But within the space allowed, they left markers like stones along a forest path, leading not to doctrine, but to memory. The Dominican Sisters of Mantua maintained for nearly a century an unnamed litany included in their morning prayers. It followed the saints. It preceded the martyred virgins. One line only for she who sat and was not counted. When the litany was revised in the early 1600s, that line was removed. The prior general called it a corruption of form, but no one ever explained its origin. Even today in some convents, a peculiar tradition persists. Once a year during a private mass, the sisters turn their chairs away from the altar for one silent minute. No word is spoken, no explanation given. To outsiders, it is symbolic. To those within it is remembrance. There are no writings to prove this connection, no decree, no surviving charter. But oral histories passed quietly through generations suggest that the moment is for her who was, not in defiance, in lament, a kind of sacred mourning for a possibility that once was and was taken. Because in every cloister there is the knowledge of erasure, women erased from texts, from relics, from the lineages of saints, women who saw, who knew, who served, and who were sealed away behind stone. Joan, if she existed, would be the embodiment of that wound. Not because she ruled, but because she was made to vanish. And vanishing in the world of cloisters is a language they understand too well. So they remember her not loudly, not clearly, but consistently, through veils, through silence, through consensus that needs no words. Velvet absorbs light. It swallows reflection, diffuses shape, muffles what lies beneath. It is the fabric of sanctuaries and secrecy hung over chalices drawn across confessionals, wrapped around things not meant to be seen. But light persistent and quiet always finds the edge. It seeps through seams, slips through folds. It does not shout. It simply remains. The Church, in its care for tradition, has always known how to use velvet. To cover relics, to shield bones, to blur moments that do not fit the liturgy. In the archives beneath the Vatican, there exists a box, plain, unlabeled, wrapped not in velvet, but in oilcloth. Its existence is not a secret, but its contents are rarely discussed. The inventory calls it Scrinium 872b, Varia non catalogata. Inside, according to one scholar who glimpsed it in 1981, is a page from a missal no longer in circulation. The page is torn, edges burnt, but still legible. The text is ordinary, a blessing for the Feast of the Assumption. But in the margin scribbled sideways are two words in faded Latin interregnum, between reigns. Not a title, not a name, just a pause. Elsewhere in the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, one can find an oddity in the ceiling frescoes beneath the layer, painted in the 17th century. Infrared scanning reveals an earlier depiction, a seated figure in papal robes but veiled. The eyes are closed. The hands hold nothing. She faces east. She faces the light. No artist is named. No patron is listed. The fresco was painted over during renovation under Pope Innocent X, officially for stylistic reasons. But light imaging preserves what paint tried to hide. Even the Vatican Library, in its vaults of forbidden or unverified texts, houses a book bound in red leather. It is not part of any public collection. No title graces its spine. Inside are verses Latin-Italian, some in Occitan, each describing a woman who led, who blessed, who was both venerated and hidden. None mention Joan by name, but everyone seems to remember her, like shadows cast by a body long removed from the room. Velvet cannot erase light. It can only delay its arrival. And so it is that despite the removals, the redactions, the rituals built to overwrite her, the story of Pope Joan flickers back into view. Not as fact, not as doctrine, but as a resistance lodged in the edges of history. In 1978, a group of theological historians convened a private symposium to re-examine anomalies in the papal line. Joan's name was never printed on the agenda, but in the margins of one notebook, later leaked briefly before disappearing, someone wrote, "What they fear is not her body. It is her possibility." Because possibility, unlike scandal, does not die. Possibility infects. It seeps into education, into questions, into the spaces children learn to ask between lessons. What if? Why not? What happened? And when even the velvet wears thin, when the curtains begin to fray at the hem, those questions glow like dust motes in a sunbeam. Not damning, just present. There is a chapel in northern Italy where once a year a candle is lit for the Pope who bore life. No further explanation, no name. The flame is small. It flickers. But it is lit all the same, because light, even when covered, waits. And velvet, no matter how thick, cannot keep it buried forever. There is a moment just before something shatters when the air thickens, not with sound, but with stillness. A suspension. A breath held so long it forgets how to exhale. History does not often mark this moment. It prefers the bang, the rupture, the clear line between before and after. But sometimes the most permanent fractures are born in silence. The story of Pope Joan, if it is story, if it is more, is not a monument. It is a crack in one, a seam beneath the polished floor of certainty. For over 1,000 years it has moved just under the surface, whispered, denied, disguised, remembered without permission. It has left no conclusive proof, and yet it has never truly disappeared. Because what she represents is not reducible to her name. She is the breath the Church never took again. The papal line, for all its gold and lineage, its creeds and conclaves, remains uninterrupted on paper. But beneath that line is an absence so precisely shaped, so consistently echoed, that its very denial becomes evidence. She was a possibility. Then she became a danger. Then a ghost. In the rarest Vatican texts, those locked away behind steel and time, there are references to a period of obscurity, a term used sparingly only when the line becomes unclear. It is never explained, it is never footnoted, but it is there. And in the world of ecclesiastical precision, even the smallest uncertainty is a fault line, one that no amount of prayer or protocol can fully repair. The idea of a woman ascending the throne of Peter is no longer unthinkable, because it never happened. It is unthinkable because someone once thought it did, and that was enough to remake ritual, to rewrite routes, to alter ceremonies that had stood unchanged for centuries. And what else is history, if not the shaping of the future through memory? In a corner of the Vatican gardens, behind a wall where visitors do not walk, there is a stone slab without inscription. It is not a grave, it is not a marker. Perhaps it is only stone. But someone once left a single lily there. Just one. Not for celebration, but for remembering. Perhaps Joan was real. Perhaps she was never crowned. Perhaps she was crowned and erased. Perhaps she was invented to remind the Church of its fragility. Or perhaps she simply happened and was not allowed to remain. In the end, it may not matter whether she ruled for years or never at all. What matters is that she was made possible by a moment, a single slippage in time, when the weight of robes could not conceal the weight of a body, and doctrine blinked. That moment is gone now, but its silence remains, folded into marble, pressed into parchment, etched into the distance between one pope's name and the next. And like all true silences, it doesn't fade. It waits.